I'll set up your. Hello, hello. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to day 2. Hope you had a blast yesterday. It was a very fulfilling day. And today is going to be really exciting too. So just make sure you have a meal ticket for lunch. Did everyone receive one? A meal ticket? Okay. And lunch today is not at 12, it's at 11:45, just to keep things on schedule. So with that being said, are you ready? So, yeah, and you can use the. Are you ready, Kirsten? You're.
Just curious, taking a little poll.
Good morning. Good morning on day 2 of this pretty dynamic conference put together by, as we know, Dr. Robert Bishara. Thank you. I hope everyone slept really well last night. I know I woke up with just so many ideas and thoughts going through my mind. So welcome to our clinical practice panel. Each speaker will have 15 minutes. And after each speaker or dyad has spoken, we will have a question and answer period. So we'll wait for questions until the end. And our first speaker today is Megan Kleintup, licensed professional counselor, and she's from the University of West Georgia. And the title of her paper is Destigmatizing Postpartum Anxiety and Depression, a Mind, Body, Other Approach. Thank you, Megan.
Is this working? Okay, I'll talk closer. As a licensed professional counselor for 13 years, I've been treating women struggling with postpartum anxiety and depression in my private practice. Traditional treatment of postpartum anxiety and depression follows a Cartesian dualistic model, which addresses the mind through psychotherapy and the body with the use of medication, usually selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, or SSRIs. Psychotherapeutic interventions are rooted in a Western individualistic framework, and overcoming symptoms lie in the woman's autonomous capacity to self-regulate. Less commonly addressed are the sociocultural factors that contribute to one's distress. While my observations are contextualized and limited to a particular demographic of middle-class women, almost always clients are referred by their medical doctors for cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, and prescribed medication. CBT is the most widely researched treatment for anxiety and is the most accepted as a primary treatment modality for alleviating symptoms. Time and again, women report in session with great exhaustion that they are aware of the cognitive tools that are needed to be implemented in order to alleviate their anxiety symptoms. Quote, my last therapist told me I need to journal, do breath work, and think positive thoughts, but I can't. I know I should, but I'm just so anxious, my client told me recently. Many women are well-versed in the psychological jargon and anxiously anticipate my pronouncements of what they need to do in order to get better. Fix me, one woman recently declared. The stories depicting their realities are disparate from what they feel the realities were meant to be. Most women describe that when they became pregnant, they expected the pregnancy and postpartum period to feel beautiful and natural and easy. Their expectations were often in relation to their own experience with their mother. Quote, I wanted to be a better mom than my own, and my mom stayed at home and loved every minute. I thought I'd be the same, but I'm not. They're carefully constructed narratives about what women are supposed to be feeling about motherhood, shows cultural roots in the motherhood myth and the ideology of intensive mothering. Due to transitional struggles, Their narratives illustrate that they are certainly missing the mark. Ratrists describe the motherhood myth as one that paints mothers as incredibly nurturing and attentive and serves as, quote, one cultural tool for manipulating mothers into excessive investment, end quote, thus serving a patriarchal agenda. Wrestling with deep-seated beliefs about what it means to be a mother, women feel like failures when they struggle in the transition. To me, the internal struggle is apparent. However, the roots are more opaque. Untangling and identifying these roots is a therapeutic work we engage with. We sit with the shame that arises from a failure of living up to the idealized norm of the good mother, as the title of anxious and depressed mom does not fit within the acceptable sociocultural mold. In this work, I began to identify key themes that emerge from their stories. These themes cross lines of race, socioeconomic status, education level, and sexual orientation, and were unified with a thread of anxiety and depression. These new mothers were experiencing similar messages from the outside world, which were directly contributing to symptoms and emotional functioning. The cultural values enacted upon and by these women are Western individualism, pathologizing women in the amelioration of symptoms, and consumerism. In this, it seems necessary for mental health practitioners to begin to treat postpartum distress from a more feminist and holistic perspective, which addresses the, quote, other, or the idealized notion of mother created and perpetuated in North American Western culture. To go through the key components of Western individualism, almost universally, my clients frame their struggle and their healing in their autonomous and innate ability or inability to recover. And time again, symptoms are exacerbated due to this internalized pressure and lack of self-efficacy in attaining a state of perceived normalcy. Western culture puts an enormous pressure on women to overcome any postpartum mental distress quickly, within 4 weeks, according to the DSM-5. The most common treatments for postpartum distress and the treatment that women request when scheduling are the utilization of CBT techniques and mindfulness practices. Each of these modalities instruct a woman on the new ways of being through action-oriented tasks. Women must do activities like breath work, positive affirmations, exercise, exposure therapy, and writing exercises. Mindfulness has been widely studied as a highly effective tool for mood management and the reduction of psychological stress. Kabat-Zinn defines it as the practice of paying attention in a particular way on purpose in the present moment and non-judgmentally. At its core, the practice is about being more than doing. However, the Western commodification of mindfulness has reduced it to a series of exercises that the individual can engage with in a task-oriented way. Women are instructed how to mindfully eat, meditate, and breathe. While the practices can be helpful in reducing the intensity of symptoms, my argument is not in opposition of mindfulness or against CBT, but rather to suggest that A, we are reducing a woman's complex experience and recovery to her ability to self-regulate through activities, and B, we are ignoring the sociocultural complexity which has contributed to her dilemma in the first place. In reducing the treatment plan to merely activities and coping techniques, we're missing the bigger picture. We reinforce her deviation from the idealized norm and perpetuate an internal sense of shame which may or may not be realized. In attachment parenting, a popular parenting philosophy influencing North American practices, for all the good that it's done in understanding development and bonding, it's also increased maternal pressure to self-regulate and live up to an idealized notion of mother. A large body of research has shown the importance of caregiving bonding, continuing Bowlby's work, and its importance is not in question. My argument is that in using this theory's ideas in a reductionistic way, i.e., a child will be permanently emotionally injured if he does not securely attach to his mother, and therefore the mother must be completely and utterly attuned to her child at all times, as a way to shame mothers into self-regulation is damaging. Ultimately, it suggests a failure to adhere to the idealized image of mother, which cultivates shame-based thinking. Additionally, an emphasis should include instruction and psychoeducation to other caregivers, at the very least the partner, if they are present, to step in while the mother recovers. With a reduction of community living, many women experience isolation in the home during the first few weeks postpartum. In this, the mother has become her own proverbial village, and within her Western sociocultural context feels the need to mother intensively on her own. Pathologizing the postpartum period is in response to a perceived variance in normalcy or correctness that is socioculturally situated and highly contextualized. The transition to motherhood has been described as overwhelming, isolating, and intensive. Despite this, an idealized image of mother persists in North American culture. What does a socially idealized version of mother encompass? Intensity, says Hayes in her revolutionary book, The Cultural Contradictions of Motherhood. Hayes coined the ideology of intensive mothering, which refers to mothers who parent in ways that are time and energy consuming and hyper-focused on the child. She writes that modern women are faced with, quote, two socially constructed cultural images of what a good mother looks like. If you are a good mother, you must be an intensive one. The only choice is whether you add the role of paid working woman. These embedded ideologies contribute to a culture of maternal anxiety. Symptoms lead to pathologizing the maternal experience if they persist beyond 4 weeks. According to the most recent edition of the DSM-5, the diagnosis of postpartum depression must occur within 4 weeks postpartum. A high number of women struggle with postpartum anxiety and depression, and researchers assert it's widely undiagnosed or recognized. There's no code for postpartum anxiety. It's a growing field of interest. Women are encouraged to recover from anxiety and depression quickly. She receives these messages from capitalistic culture, family, the medical profession. In my practice, most women report that someone asks that they seek help. For women returning to the workplace, they report anxiety and fear about leaving the child. If there's breastfeeding, there's an additional pressure to produce enough milk while pumping away from the baby. Under the Family Medical and Leave Act, the U.S. Department of Labor allows women to take up to 12 weeks of unpaid. Only 6 of the 12 weeks are paid. Of course, many women do not have the privilege to miss 6 additional weeks of work after the initial paid period ends. Interestingly enough, the dictum of a 4-week recovery fits nicely within the 6-week maternity leave policy in the United States and the 2-week efficacy period of SSRI medications. If we consider this dynamic, a woman should be ready to return to work free from distress with the help of SSRI medication within the allotted time period. Juxtaposed to this imperative is a recommendation from the World Health Organization that women should breastfeed for 6 months. This makes it incredibly difficult for women to establish breastfeeding within a 6-week period. Quote, without access to family leave, many parents are forced to go back to work before they're able to establish breastfeeding, fully heal from childbirth, and forge a thriving bond. Post-World War II consumerism has driven the masses for decades and has shaped the identity of women in the experience of motherhood. Cushman suggests that in the post-war era, Americans experienced a loss of family, community, and tradition, which contributed to his notion of a, quote, empty self, catapulting a new self-improvement movement in America. The American attempt to fill the empty self was capitalized upon by advertising in the wellness and psychotherapy industries. This consumerist movement, coupled with a wellness revolution, are the perfect ingredients for the creation of an idealized sociocultural mother. It continues to this day. In session together, women describe their anxious desires to feed their kids organic, homemade foods and optimize eco-friendly products. The women I work with talk about wanting to do it all, work out, look great, cook meals, work full-time. Consumer-driven initiatives feed these anxieties with organic sections at the grocery store, bedding, and neoliberal books with names like Mommy Hacks, 100-plus science-backed shortcuts to reclaim your body, raise awesome kids, and be unstoppable. Countless consumer products reinforce the culturally contextualized maternal norm. A mode of disseminating this consumerist information is via social media and websites. The technologizing of motherhood allows women to have global access to mothering practices, including those of celebrities. Prior to the digital age, women had a small sect of women in which to base their mothering practices, which would include their own family members, friends, and community. With the advent and subsequent explosion of social media, cultural messages to new mothers are now globalized. If a woman is struggling with breastfeeding, a quick Google search, she can obtain endless information from around the world. Gentilla suggests that online motherhood communities enhance connection at a time where women feel isolated. And acknowledging its benefits, we must also remember that social media is a prime feeder for self-comparison, and I see this in my clients every day. Countless clients report that social media makes them feel, quote, jealous, inferior, and anxious. Access to celebrity accounts make motherhood look glamorous and beautiful. Social media reinforces the motherhood myth and ideologies of intensive mothering, encouraging modern women to do it all. In suggesting a mind-body-other approach, my aim is that therapists will begin to integrate a critical perspective, evaluating how socio-cultural contextuality contributes to symptoms. In doing so, we will shift the autonomous burden of healing away from the woman in an attempt to reduce shame and enhance self-compassion. Pathologizing of women, especially within 4 weeks postpartum, is reductionistic, damaging, and limiting. CBT should be taught merely as an aid for symptom management in tandem with holistic counseling. As a holistic feminist and socio-culturally engaged therapists and scholars, we must begin to challenge the ingrained ideologies that overburden women who are already carrying a disproportionate load. In doing so, we work towards creating and implementing therapeutic models that avoid further harming those who are seeking help. Thank you.
Thank you, Megan. Our next speaker today is Dr. Madison Silverstein from Loyola University, New Orleans. The title of her paper is Improving Referral and Diagnostic Decisions Through Critical Psychology.
Can you black out the screen while I do this? All right. So this morning I'm going to talk about bias and referral and diagnostic decisions and how we can use critical psychology to improve these decisions, or at least to think a little bit differently about these decisions. And so how I'll do this is I will use my experience working at a large public hospital that primarily serves underserved populations like racial and ethnic minorities who are living in poverty. And I'm going to go through a couple of case studies illustrating bias in referral and diagnostic decisions. So a lot of research is showing now that providers are making biased decisions, and this is leading to health disparities. And health disparities are inequalities in how certain groups of people receive health care. And so we largely see racial and ethnic minority individuals and individuals living in poverty receiving worse health care and having worse health outcomes. However, providers believe that it's not their bias in these decisions that they're making, but rather it's the larger social, economic factors that are playing the bigger role in health disparities. So our goal then should be to get providers to understand that they too are playing a role in health disparities through their attitudes and beliefs about certain types of populations. So here is a flow chart that kind of explains how health disparities happen in large public hospitals. And this model is really focusing on the provider's role in health disparities. So first, a provider makes an incorrect diagnosis due to bias, which on the one hand leads to an incorrect referral decision. So when someone is referred to another provider, there's often an incredibly long wait time in these large public health systems because they're understaffed and there's just not enough resources to go around. So during that long wait time, the patient's condition is going to worsen or just not improve. Finally, when the patient is seen by that new provider, they have to be referred again because it was the wrong referral decision. So then that long wait time happens again, and this just becomes a vicious cycle that leads to worse health outcomes in general. On the other hand, that incorrect diagnosis due to bias can lead to incorrect treatment, where the patient's condition will worsen or just not improve. This patient might say, hey, I need to go back to the doctor. In order to schedule an appointment, there's going to be a really long wait time where their condition will just worsen or not improve. And again, that'll lead to worse health outcomes. And to illustrate an example of this, I was working with, or to illustrate an example of just a long wait time, I was working with a man who was diagnosed with sleep apnea, and he was waiting 4 years for his CPAP. And I don't really know how bias was playing a role in that situation, but that is just a really perfect example of these really long wait times. So his condition was just worsening and worsening over those 4 years. So there's also health disparities that happen when a provider puts an incorrect diagnosis in the patient's chart. So most of these, when I'm talking about an incorrect diagnosis here, I'm talking about a mental health diagnosis. And so in a large public hospital where psychological services are integrated into just general medical care, any provider can see any diagnosis. So your primary care provider, your heart surgeon, your allergist, they can see your mental health diagnoses. And so say you're given a diagnosis that has a lot of stigma attached to it. When you're seen by another provider, that provider is going to generate an impression of you based on this diagnosis. And so some particularly dangerous diagnoses to be giving out in these large public health systems are bipolar disorder, borderline personality disorder, antisocial personality disorder, and schizophrenia. Because these, when a provider sees these diagnoses, they're automatically going to generate a not so good impression of you and take your concerns less seriously. So they'll be more likely to make an incorrect diagnostic decision when you're just going in for a normal checkup or for a complaint about chronic pain. They'll assume that, hey, you're coming in here because of your mental health diagnosis. Your medical concerns aren't that valid, which leads to worse health outcomes in the long run. So I'm going to go through some case studies now that illustrate how bias has played a role in increasing health disparities. So this first case study involves a Southeast Asian woman in her 50s who was referred to the diagnostic clinic that I was working in by a plastic surgeon. And she was seeking a psychological evaluation for a breast augmentation. And this is absolutely not typical to get a psych eval for a breast augmentation. For gastric bypass surgery, yes, very typical. You need a psych eval, but for a breast augmentation, this is unheard of. So this woman did not speak English, and she was accompanied by her husband. And we had to use a language cart, and there's a photo of what it looks like right there. It is like an iPad, and it has internet connection to a translator service, and you basically FaceTime with a translator. So there was only one translator available that day who spoke her language, and she had interacted with this translator before in other capacities, like in other departments in the health system, and she did not like this translator. So that added a whole nother layer of difficulties to this diagnostic session because she felt like this translator was judgmental and was judging her for wanting this breast augmentation. So after reading between the lines of the plastic surgeon's note who referred her to this diagnostic evaluation, I started to realize that she was referred because this plastic surgeon, who was a white woman, believed that her husband was coercing her to get this breast augmentation. And the note also implied that this Southeast Asian woman who was in her 50s didn't really need this breast augmentation. It wasn't necessary. She was a little too old, and she was married. So she was taking her own feminist values and ideals and placing them on this woman as her own ideals. And that's where transnational feminism comes in. So whenever we're making diagnostic or referral decisions, we need to make sure that we're not placing our own feminist values on women from other cultures. We don't need to assume that we need to rescue these women from their husbands or that their husbands are automatically controlling them and making decisions for them. So at the end of the day, we cleared her for her psych eval. She didn't have any mental health difficulties. But I think that there is lasting damage from this referral decision because she's probably going to be less likely to come back to the healthcare system that put her through this horrible burden when she actually has a medical concern in the future. So the second case study involves a black man in his 20s who was in the psychiatric inpatient unit due to a heroin overdose. And I was working with a psychiatry resident to do his psych workup and to figure out a good treatment plan for him. So we came to very different conclusions about what was going on with this gentleman. So the psychiatry resident took symptoms like lying, stealing, and the overdose itself as evidence for antisocial personality disorder, whereas I took those same symptoms to mean that he had a substance use disorder with major depressive disorder. And so it seems like in this case, race was the factor that was used to make the differential diagnosis. Because when you're making a differential diagnosis between antisocial personality disorder and substance use disorder, things like lying, stealing, and overdoses are going to show up with both, but you have to understand that within a substance use disorder, those things are occurring because of substance use, not because of underlying callousness or disregard for authority. So race seemed to be playing a very large role here in the differential diagnosis. And so since this was a psychiatry unit, the psychiatry resident's opinion won out, and treatment planning immediately became less focused on mental health and substance use and more focused just on discharge planning. Okay, where is this guy gonna go live? Where are we gonna place him for housing? Which of course will lead to worse health outcomes for this individual in the long run because he's not getting the help that he needs. And then the third case study involves a black trans woman in her 30s who presented to the psychiatric ED for suicidal plan and intent. And this woman was a frequent user of the psychiatric ED services, so she would present about once a month with a suicidal plan or intent. And in her chart, it indicated that she had borderline personality disorder. And alarmingly, the doctors who were present during the initial intake and throughout her triage process did not use the correct pronoun. So they were referring to her as he, with each other and around the patient. And so here, They created a situation where social oppression, they were creating a situation of social oppression in which they were refusing to use the correct pronoun, which increased her need for them to use the correct pronoun, her need for gender affirmative language, which increased her distress, and it created just this vicious cycle of her becoming more and more distressed. And this borderline personality disorder diagnosis really threw everything else off too, because they weren't taking her complaints seriously. Because if you have borderline personality disorder, in your chart, people will assume you're manipulative and you're just crying wolf, you just want attention. And so, thankfully, in this situation, this woman was okay. There was no suicide attempt after this, but there might have been. And they would not have taken her complaint seriously because of this borderline personality disorder diagnosis. So, I guess overall, I really want to caution the use of certain diagnoses in large public health systems because of how poorly people will be treated because of these diagnoses. So when you're giving a diagnosis like borderline or antisocial personality disorder or bipolar disorder, I really think that we need to be more cautious about when and how we're doing this, because these diagnoses can actually hurt people in the long run. And I think with any diagnosis, the point should be to help people, help them get the correct treatment. So that is all I have for you today. Thank you so much for listening.
Absolutely. Is it possible to turn off the presentation? So the last presentation will be done by both Dr. Jessica Joseph of Princeton University and Dr. Jessica Chavez of Tulane University. The title is Using Critical Psychology and Decolonizing Healing Models of Care to Examine College Mental Health Interventions. Thank you so much. So now we're able to take some questions. And we ask that you address your question to one member of the panel or specify whether it's for the whole panel. And please just step up to the podium to ask your question, and we'll begin.
Hello, and thank you all very much. There's a lot to take in. My question, I guess, is primarily directed to Madison, but since you're all clinical psychologists, it applies to everyone. I really, found interesting the 3 case studies, but I wanted to raise the question of diagnosis itself being problematic. Certainly yours was a more humane diagnosis, but in the end, to me, diagnosis seems to be a commodification of emotional pain so that the insurance companies can pay for it. And I just wanted to get your response to that whole notion of diagnosis as an approach.
Yes, diagnosis is problematic in and of itself, and I'm glad that you raised that point. I feel trapped in a system where I really can't get away from that. So within the constraints that I'm operating within, I will always have to diagnose if I want to treat, if I want to see patients. So I guess this presentation was me trying to just take one step down from how much I have to diagnose and raise just one small issue with it without getting into all of the other complexities. Because I think no matter how much we want diagnosis to go away and how harmful it can be, or how harmful it is, it's probably here to stay, at least for a while.
I think sometimes in my work also, we're empowered we don't necessarily have to use diagnoses because we don't bill insurance, which is freeing. But then there are situations sometimes where students are seeking accommodation for a disability and need those accommodations in order to stay in school. And it always brings up really interesting questions, I think, when or when students or patients are sort of needing these diagnostic labels to access resources and accommodations that they need. Also in hospital settings where people are denied disability benefits because they don't have sort of the right diagnosis. I think we can sort of leverage diagnosis in some ways that can be helpful for people, but then we're still sort of left grappling, I think, with the problematic nature of the system itself.
Do you have a thought on that yet?
Yeah, but I just wanted to add that I joined insurance in order to reach people who weren't able to afford therapy. So for me, it was a moral issue, but I have to diagnose. And so I always talk with my clients and tell them that I have to do this so that you can come and, being trapped by the system, but we have a conversation about it. And I think that's really healing for the person who I'm working with to understand that I'm not labeling them and kind of move beyond that stigma.
I second that conversation as not perfect, but the kind of the best we got right now.
Right.
So.
Molly?
Good morning. Thank you all for being here today. My overreaching feeling about this presentation is that I'm so warmed that you all are in places and spaces with the frameworks that you're working with helping people. So just to say that, I'm excited that you guys are there. And thank you for coming and sharing. I have 2 questions. So forgive me for being inquisitive, but I'm wondering, first for Megan, I'm wondering how the role of fatherhood impacts your work both in the model that you brought to us today, but also just in the room with your clients. And then for Madison, I'm intrigued by your presentation, and I do domestic violence work in a hospital, and it's a very interesting place to do that work, and I'm wondering how, I guess we run into a lot of compartmentalization in the scope of work of each of these different entities in a hospital, and how that kind of disassociates them from their impact on the client that they're working with, especially when it comes to mental health. And so I'm wondering if you have any thoughts or ideas about how to sort of, I don't know, maybe bring the humanity back or bring the collaboration back between these different sort of departments in a hospital.
And yeah, thanks for asking about fathers. And I think it's a huge and important topic because I think the scope of fatherhood is changing, and it has to. But what I see, and I've seen for many years, is when a woman becomes a mother, there's this shift in the relationship dynamic. And over I hear them talking about their partners. And this goes for same-sex couples as well, as more childlike. And there's this shift into all-encompassing mother, and they describe their partners as the fun one, or doesn't quite understand and slips in at times. And of course, this is not across the board. There are some really wonderful partners, but I hear that over and over, and it's this kind of this really pronounced shift, and I see it so clearly. And they say, "Oh, he's so sweet. Oh, he's so cute," and it's this kind of infantizing of the partner, and so I think it's a complicated issue, and one that's important for clinicians to think about and try to bring partners in, and also kind of psychosocialize them to understand what's happening, and it brings up a lot of gender roles that are activated in that transition.
So I think what you're asking is, how do we get different departments within hospitals to work together towards improving mental health? So one way that I've seen it work really well is having a group of volunteers, normally undergraduates who are majoring in psychology, They have them volunteer within a specific mental health clinic in the hospital. And the one mental health clinic that did it at the hospital I was at was a mental health clinic that served African American women who had attempted suicide or experienced domestic violence. And these undergraduate volunteers would go to every single department in the hospital every day and go up to people and ask them if they would like to take a brief survey to see if they qualified for services at this clinic, at this mental health clinic. And so that's how we got most of our patients, through just walking up to people in waiting rooms throughout different departments. So if they were there for a primary care visit or dermatology or anything, we could catch them that way. So that was one really good way. There was a lot of pushback at first, and some departments did not allow the undergraduates to go to their department, but overall it worked really well. And then another way that I've seen it work well is there is a primary care department that has integrated psychological services. So it's a primary care department that is headed up by a psychiatrist / primary care provider. So she specializes in both. And so she was able to create this wonderful place where individuals would come for their primary care appointment, but also have a mental health checkup every single time. So I think those are two really good ways to try and get departments to work together.
My question is, what effect are you seeing upon the students of the larger political issues taking place within the country, which is the largest one being, even though it's sort of submerged in the public consciousness, is the war, the perpetual war. And just for background, I'm a lawyer who represents Guantanamo prisoners. And in the course of that, I've had to do a lot of research, or more so, wanted to do a lot of research into what is taking place here today in this country, and how does that compare to other similar experiences of other countries. And I'm thinking in particular, say, of 1930s Germany, 1930s Italy, Japan, in the same period, where the heroization of the military, became paramount. And so even though, and just further background, I've attended both as auditing law school classes of my colleague who's taught at Georgetown and Columbia law schools, and then also got a master's degree in the New School in 2018. And so my experience, I have some experience with college students, and there's variety of, because obviously college students come from a variety of backgrounds. So what I found amazing was that some students at the New School, and I won't, a PhD student even stood up and said, well, at least we're not at war, so our constitutional rights are safe, even though an Islamic, Muslim student, an Arab-looking student or whatever, would obviously know that our constitutional rights are not safe. They've been violated repeatedly, and other people who are familiar with that as well. And it also has an overflow effect, spillover effect into law enforcement and other things, where particular students might be targeted just because of what they appear to be as perhaps a potential terrorist. And when the second speaker talked about diagnosis and how misdiagnosis is passed on, it reminded me of a interrogation reports, where one interrogator starts off with the presumption that the person is a terrorist because he's obviously a Muslim and he's picked up by the U.S. Army, and then that just gets passed on from daisy chain down, with each further interrogator expecting taking the earlier report that misdiagnosis that he's a terrorist and continuing that on. I don't mean to be too long, so I'm getting to my point here, but studying German history. And it seems to me that today, with 20 years and studying theorists of war like Hannah Arendt and Clausewitz, they recognize that violence comes from the culture and you can see the political changes that took place in Germany because of the heroization, and this is what Germans were writing about at the time, like German Jews, of how the country is becoming so militaristic. And it seems to me we're seeing the same process today. Islamophobia is obviously alive in the colleges, and so that generates a lot of political opposition, but that's related directly to the wars. And when I say wars, I mean from the Department of Defense viewpoint. We're in a perpetual war, and our enemy keeps changing. So I'm just curious what you might be seeing within the colleges on how that might potentially be affecting students. And one final thing is the Newtown shooter. That was a classic case of a person enmeshed so much in the war mentality that this young man, finally took his military gun and did a military operation against a school, killing a lot of students. And we're seeing that same war, celebration of the warrior mentality so much. Every baseball game you go to, football game, walk into Barnes & Noble, it's covered with books about the hero, various SEALs and special forces, etc. And how much is that affecting the mentality of your students, do you think? Both in the victim sense, the Muslims or Islamic students, and the perpetrators maybe, not necessarily in violence, but just in this supremacy because we're not, it's a supremacy because we're not Muslim. So therefore we have to treat the enemy or potential enemy more severely.
I have a lot of thoughts. I think a lot, right? I think something that I think we're trying to argue here is the importance of politicizing the therapeutic milieu and the ways in which what's happening in the world impacts anybody we're working with, right? For Jessica and I, students, but whoever you're working with. And the ways I've seen that is this, I work with many like Arab and Middle Eastern identified students because I'm kind of self-selected in those ways, and I really like that, and I feel honored to do the work. And I see currently the ways in which like a strong kind of disavowal from the identity that is Muslim, the identity that is Islam, is really relevant in the therapeutic material. And it creates a sense of self that is distanced from the other, or distanced from the other that is quote-unquote dangerous. And so a lot of times the work is finding, at someone's own pace perhaps, gelling that experience back together with that sense of self, while also acknowledging and kind of grieving the ways in which that has been so utterly destroyed by their surroundings historically and present.
Would you say there's also a way in which a sort of adaptive sense of paranoia and self-consciousness presents in a lot of students too, that feels kind of conspicuous on campus for whatever reason, but often because they feel like they're going to be perceived as being a terrorist or...
We clinical psychologists are really throw paranoia around, which it's just like nothing, I think. And I think that it's important to kind of reclaim the legitimacy in being paranoid or worried about what will happen to you. So I really appreciate that pointing out. And maybe we need to be like, yeah, of course, why wouldn't you be?
And also speaking to the phenomenon of kind of like school shootings and as it's sort of a spin-off from war mentality and culture, I think it puts faculty and staff in an interesting position, and I often consult with faculty and staff who call, who feel like it's sort of, they've become sort of ad hoc ears to the ground, so to speak, and are sort of pressured to report suspicious behavior in students, pressured to notice and report changes in students, to be sort of like preventing and identifying potential school shooters, which I think creates a lot of anxiety among both the students. So I think they feel that faculty and staff can't really hear or make space for their emotions when they come to them in distress, because the faculty and staff members are often so anxious about, like, what do I do with this information? Who am I supposed to report this to? Do I need to assess whether this person is a danger to other people? So I think it really disrupts the ability for a lot of genuine emotional contact between faculty and staff and students on campuses.
Yeah, so I have a comment, but coming from not the student side, but the veteran side. So I worked in a VA and then in a private clinic just for veterans that was funded by the Wounded Warrior Project. And so in both settings, like pretty much almost every day, I had to listen to a very traumatic event that a veteran had gone through. And about half of those are harm done to others, harm done to civilians or other military forces abroad in the war. And so how veterans are treated with respect, and they automatically get treatment for committing harm to other people, whereas students who are here struggling with being harmed, they don't have that same opportunity, they don't have that same privilege. It's really frustrating because millions and millions of dollars are from the Wounded Warrior Project just being poured into treating veterans who have done pretty horrible things, but the same isn't being given to students and other people here who are suffering from being harmed. So,
yeah, it's complicated too because I think ROTC programs on campuses they provide students are recruited into and accept those programs often because they don't have other options for higher education, and I think that's important to keep in mind, that sometimes I think that there's a way in which, the recruitment process
they're forced into it.
Yeah.
Hello. Hey. So thank you all so much for your presentations. I've been thinking about a lot during the past hour and a half or so, but I want to address a question directly to the Jessicas. So you brought up a lot of interesting things about, obviously the university is like a neoliberal institution, right, and care of the self, technology of the self, etc. And your position is very interesting in that way and does have some kind of weird political potency where you're directly interacting with sad affects, right, directly. So I wonder, rather than reinforcing the individual problem, person who goes to therapy to get fixed, right, because we're not talking about an individual problem, we're talking about all students in all neoliberal universities, right? They all present or share a lot of the same problems. So I'm wondering if there's a way to or have you thought about communizing this problem, right? Making it not an individual thing, but a group phenomena, and with your position, if that is something that is possible, as an intervention. So, thank you.
Yeah, I think in doing that, you have to I would think about the spheres that influence a student's life before they get to college, because I think students are sold the idea that their campus and their school is going to be a community and kind of a unified social space, when students come to that space with so many different experiences that have impacted them before they even got to college, call different places home, and have had different experiences of race, of social class, and along with that experience sexual violence as children before even getting to campus, which is something that we spend a lot of time helping students understand and heal from. So I think it's hard to think about what is the sphere of the university versus other spaces that influence students, and where do we sort of draw the line between what we can do on campus and what is part of, I think, just a larger political project of being engaged and trying to work to help students' chances of not having these experiences before they get to campus. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it was a really good question. I think the position I have currently, I actually do a lot of forward-facing student work, where I'm not actually only in quote-unquote individual psychotherapy spaces. And the way that I grapple with that, though, I think there's this tension, right? Because I have a lot of ideas, I think, and also I'm not a student anymore. And I think it's actually really important to not suggest how kind of that organizing looks from a student perspective. I don't believe I should be that person. And so the way that I kind of grapple with that is I really students, I'm down to support student organizations when they ask me to come into the spaces. And give my opinions on it, provide what they need, provide my confidential support resource that I am, and then step on back. And I actually don't, and then, so doing that work that way with the students, and then doing this work right here with quote unquote non-students. And I think that's actually an important distinction to make as to how the university then could change. Because I'm paid by the university, like I cannot change it. I truly do believe that until I'm not paid by it. So that's how I deal with that tension, if that's useful at all.
Any more questions? Well, thank you very much. I want to thank each of you very personally, and let's have another round of applause. Great job. It's so interesting to hear.
All right, so we have a break till 10:15, and then we have the ethics, politics, aesthetics panel.